Hello, everybody, and welcome to another session of the IGRA 2020 webinar series. Today with Ellen Kowitt, talking about Ukraine 2020, update your research plan. My name is Daniel Horowitz, and I'm more than happy to have you all here. Before we start, a few housekeeping things. First of all, you're more than welcome to type your questions and comments on the question panel. I will be trying to address as much as I can, but at the end, Ellen will have some spare time to answer all your questions, and she will tell you exactly what type of questions you should be asking. Also, I would like to invite you to our website, genealogy.org.il, where you can find more information not only about this and other webinars that we're planning in the future, but also about our show and tells, both English and Hebrew, that we are doing every week, and other events that we are planning and database releases that we are doing at least once a month. The next big event that IGRA has is the Yom Yun, or the one-day seminar. It's going to be on June 23, and you have to pre-register for that, totally free. Yes, you don't need to pay, you only have to register. The URL is the one that you are seeing on the screen, bit.ly/IGRA but I also put it on the chat. If you want to take it from there, you can do it with no problem. From 11 o'clock in the morning till 2, we're actually having lectures in Hebrew. Then we do a break and we go from 3 p.m. to 7 with lectures in English. So it's one URL, one registration. You get all the lectures and all the fun totally free. Now, I need to click this, and yes, our presenter today is Ellen Kowitt. She is the past president of the JGS Colorado and the JGS Great Washington, Washington D.C. That is. She served on the IAJGS board, not together with me, but we are have at least that in common. And she is also the recipient of the IAJGS Program and Stern Awards. Ellen publishes articles in Avutenu, the International Journal on Jewish Genealogy, and lectures often in conferences. I have met her there a lot of times. She's currently the vice president of the Colorado chapter of the Association of Professional Genealogists, and accepts clients when she isn't volunteering as project manager for Jewish Gen, Yizkor Books, Kehila Links, or the Ukraine SIG. Liubar Town Leader Research Project, which she coordinates for 23 years. That's a lot. Ellen has indexed naturalization and probate records at the Colorado State Archive, memorial plaques, gravestone, mohel records, JCRS, patient application, or everything that you provide to her. Last summer, she actually traveled to Ukraine as part of the Protecting Memory Project, and she will definitely give us all her inputs and how to deal with our research. So Ellen, welcome.
Hello.
Yes,
Thank
yes,
you.
yes. Now we can hear you. And now we will be able to see your presentation. And you said that you want to remind people something about questions, right?
I do. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. A special welcome to my relatives that I see on the webinar today. Thank you for coming. I am going to allow for questions at the end. Daniel's going to help me with your questions that you write into the chat area. And I'm just going to ask that you keep them sort of general and relevant to the lecture. You're welcome to email me or contact me afterwards with more personal or specific inquiries, but please don't ask about whether there are records for your individual town. For one, I'm not going to know the answer without looking at the same resources I'm providing to you today, but it also isn't of interest to everyone when we get that specific with your surnames or towns. So please ask those questions that are more general, and let's get going. I have a lot to cover today. I hope that we can get to it all. This is being recorded, so if I go too quickly through a slide and there's a URL, you will have access to see the slides and the URLs again afterwards. So let's get started. I call this Ukraine 2020 Update Your Research Plan because I updated my own research plan. As you heard in my bio, I started doing this research back in the 1990s, over 25 years ago, and I did a lot with what was available at the time. And some of those resources that we're going to talk about are still around and have evolved, but there are so many more resources and things have changed. So who should be updating their research plan? I know that this is IGRA, this is the Israel Genealogy Research Association, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about comes from my perspective as an American who predominantly only speaks English, as is the case with a lot of American Jewish genealogists. I will mention that I'm married to an Israeli, so I do have some minor Hebrew and Yiddish skills, and I certainly have a network of Hebrew speakers surrounding me, but I would never give a lecture in Hebrew. So who else should be updating their research plan besides English speakers? Veteran researchers who did research like I did in the past, back in the 90s or in the early 2000s, and really put aside their research thinking they had found everything they were going to find regarding Ukraine. And then newcomers who are brand new to this, I'm going to try to give a little bit of context and background on the basics of how to research Jewish genealogy in Ukraine, but there are many other webinars and lectures out there that notice that with IGRA, even in the webinar library, there are 2 earlier webinars on Ukraine research done in 2014 and 2016 by Tomasz Jankowski. So as a reference point, those would be worth revising and revisiting. I'm going to talk a little bit about how travel has changed, because I was fortunate to travel to Ukraine twice in the 1990s and then again this past year. Things have massively changed, and I'll try to give you an analysis of how things have changed. For those of you who have never traveled, maybe it will inspire you to visit, and for those of you who went many years ago, you might want to consider going back. So the other point I'd like to make is that everyone needs to be their own advocate for research. No one does research for us. There's no magic file. And as you're going to see, there's not a centralized location for a lot of these resources. So you need to sort of look at what your towns are and identify what's best for your research plan. Be your own advocate. So why now? Ukraine is westernized in recent years. There was the Euromaidan sort of uprising in 2013 and 14, and Ukraine joined the European Union. Something else that's different is that there are so many online language tools that can help to navigate foreign languages. Back in the 90s, we didn't really have that. Access to records in Ukraine has increased and continues to improve. I even found one very exciting announcement that this month on the Ukraine Archives website that we'll look at. You need to consider that Jewish Gen, although wonderful, and we're going to look at what the basic resources there are today, Jewish Gen is not the only source for Ukraine genealogy research. And you need to broaden your research plan and consider thinking outside of the Jewish Gen world. Keeping up with the new resources is not centralized. You need to do it for yourself. Another point, things have changed in terms of the culture of the people who are in Ukraine. It used to be everyone sort of came of age and came out of the Soviet sort of culture and lifestyle, and there was a lot of silence. But now we're finding that even the old timers who were former Soviets are talking about and documenting their history. Academics were not publishing about the Holocaust by bullets, partially because the archives were not open to Western researchers until after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but then academics had to catch up, reviewing archival materials, training a generation of new academics and scholars on what they could and couldn't look at that hadn't been reviewed before. Let's consider that a lot of the stories we learned about the Holocaust growing up were really about the concentration camps. And this whole notion of the Holocaust by bullets, that's coined by Father Patrick Dubois of Yachad and Unam, really is a concept that a lot of Westerners, and even Jewish Westerners, didn't understand was a different Holocaust story. Shtetl schlepping, and in that I mean travel to your shtetl, has become more comfortable, and you can be much more productive with research, as I hope I'll demonstrate with the examples I provide. I found that both Jewish and Gentile locals wanted to help me as a genealogist and as a traveler. And I want to also put a plug in here about town group projects on and off Jewish Gen. There are town group projects through JRI Poland and Ukraine SIG, and I think that the way we raise money and how we find volunteers has evolved, and we need to talk about it. Okay, so in the 1990s, I traveled to Ukraine twice, in 1997 and 1999, and there were some real points about what my experience was that I'd like to share. There was a sense of fear, there was a sense of silence, there was great poverty, and people were speaking Russian. So when I talk about fear, what I mean by that is that there was fear on both sides. I had relatives, there we go. I had relatives who were fearful of me traveling to Ukraine because of lingering anti-Semitism and sort of an expectation that I wasn't really wanted to come back. I do have relatives who are alive. I even have relatives in my own generation who were born in Kiev. And a few of them traveled with me in 1997, but not all of them, because there was fear. There was also fear on the other side when we got there. There was a sort of a fear and an uncertainty about outsiders, Americans. I never experienced any anti-Semitism myself when I traveled in the 90s, but I wouldn't say that even within the Jewish genealogy community that as many people were traveling. I think it was the beginning of when everyone started going. Keep in mind that in 1991, only 6 years prior to my trip, the Ukraine had gained its independence, and so there was still a lot of lingering Soviet mentality and facilities. Similarly with silence, it was more of the culture of the Soviet era to not talk about the past, to not talk about what an eyewitness might have seen occur in a small town during the Holocaust by bullets, silence about knowing Jews or even being Jewish. And I think there was some of that still lingering in the 90s. There was also great poverty. I thought that was the norm in Ukraine, and it took going back last year and talking to locals about my experiences and my impressions in the 90s to learn that, in fact, it was just a very poverty-stricken time in Ukraine in the 90s. I have an example about a restaurant story that I'll share with you later in the presentation. The poverty affected everything. The archival facilities, the preservation of documents, whether there was enough staff in an archive or if they had been properly trained, or even a willingness to help outsiders. Travel options were very different, and I'll highlight a couple of how those examples have really come a long way in 25 years. So in 1997, I traveled with my family. It was a private trip. It was my father, my brother, and 3 of my cousins. In this picture on the upper right, 4 of the 6 of us are at the mass grave memorial in 1997 in my grandfather, my paternal grandfather's birth town of Luber, Ukraine. The other 2 people on the left side, the young man in the blue jacket and his mother standing in front of him, were actually local Jewish residents of Luber who were still there at the time, as well as the older woman Maya's mother was still alive, and a couple of other elders. And we were able to meet with those Jewish residents in Luber who helped us navigate the town. It was a rainy day, as you can see. We had to walk a mile in mud to get to the mass grave site. The cemetery in the lower right corner picture shows that it was overgrown, although we were able to walk around. You can see on the road, there are very few roads in these small former shtetl towns in rural Ukraine. The cows use the same roads at the beginning of the day and the end of the day, and it can slow down traffic. Overall, because of the rain, there weren't a lot of townspeople around, and it was not a comfortable trip in terms of getting there and being there in the rain and navigating what was left. But like many people, going to your town is such a wonderful experience. It connects you, it makes you feel closer to your family's stories, perhaps to people that you knew who are no longer around. And whether you find a single document or not, walking in those footsteps of your ancestors, I found it to be a very rewarding experience. In contrast, though, having gone back now a couple more times and more recently in a much more comfortable way, I have to say that I did things wrong because I just didn't know how to do a shtetl trip back then. But regardless, in 1999, 2 years later, because I had gone on that trip and publicized it, the founder of Jewish Gen, Susan King, asked me to lead one of the first Jewish Gen shtetl schlepper trips to Ukraine. Jewish Gen no longer offers this program, but at the time, I really enjoyed it. It was a different perspective going back to the same places that I had been with my family, but surrounded by people like me who are researchers and were asking research-related questions and interested in documents and photos. And it was a different type of trip depending on the type of person that you go with. I didn't have a lot of time to go back to Luber, although I did go spend half a day. We were busy in all the other nearby shtetls that other people on the trip were interested in. But I had been advised in going back so soon after my first trip, there weren't really any new records. I thought I had done everything, and someone said, you know what, go talk to one of the clergy in the town. Ask them if Jews were buried in the Christian cemeteries. Ask the church if they knew about records or if there were records that had not gone to church repositories elsewhere. So I went to the biggest church, which happened to be a Catholic church. It was one of the oldest church buildings in the town. And I found this young Polish priest who sat down with me for an hour and didn't know anything about records, but was very gracious and friendly and directed me to where the various Christian cemeteries were, which we then went to. And you can see on the right, were as overgrown or worse than the Jewish cemeteries. In many cases, they were marked with wood or metal crosses that didn't even have names on them. And no, I did not find a single Jewish stone or indication that any kind of Jews were buried in this Christian denomination cemetery. So I came back from the trip and I took all the information I had and I created one of my Kahila Links websites for Luber, and I've continued to maintain it to this day. That was in 1999. And really for the next few years, I continued to go to conferences, read Avutenu, follow Jewish Gen. It was around the time that the Ukraine SIG was transitioning from a lot of regional, smaller special interest groups into the main Ukraine SIG. And I paid attention, but there were really no new records or resources. And over time, although I continued for the next, I don't know, 16 years to go to conferences and sort of peripherally listen for new materials and opportunities for Ukraine research, I really didn't learn a lot. I felt like I had extinguished what was available to me and there wasn't a lot of new information. And not being a Russian language speaker, I really didn't branch out. I moved on to other branches of my family in that time, worked on my Prussians, on my Hungarians, on my Polish. I held some leadership roles, did volunteer indexing work, was always sort of connected with the Jewish genealogy community, but I never circled back to Ukraine research until something extraordinary happened. In the fall of 2018, I was contacted by an academic by the name of Ray Brandon. And some of you may recognize Ray's name. He and Wendy Lauer have written some excellent books about the history of Ukraine and the Holocaust. And Ray had found my Luber Kahila Links website online and had questions about Luber. So we corresponded back and forth, and he was working as a contractor for a Berlin-based nonprofit project called the Protecting Memory Project. He was tasked with doing the background research on the towns and the Jewish and Gypsy history so that they could erect memorials on mass grave sites where Jews and Gypsies had been killed in the Holocaust by bullets. So I graciously let him quote materials from my website. I answered his questions. I provided him with photos and names of other families from Luber. And he eventually decided to include a lot of that material in some printed literature. And he eventually asked me if I would be willing to allow the Protecting Memory Project to put a photo of my family on a steel memorial they were erecting in Luber. Of course, I said yes. So where my overall impressions in the 90s of travel to Ukraine were about fear and silence and poverty, going into 2019 when the memorials were erected, it was more a sense of pride, honor, and obligation to tell the stories. I was proud and excited that my Luber website, someone actually read it, found it, and used it. And I was honored that they were putting my family on this memorial as one of two families that were representative really of the lost Jewish history of Luber. And then my friends started saying to me, well, of course you have to go if they're doing an opening ceremony. I wasn't actually invited, but I went back and said, is there going to be an opening ceremony? Would there be a place or a part for me to play in that? They were thrilled that I suggested it, so thrilled they even paid for part of my trip to participate. And I ended up going with them to their press conferences, to another memorial and another town's opening, participating in 2 memorial openings in Luber. Local academics and Jewish community leaders, the people in Berlin and nationally. It was quite an international staff. And it kind of looked like this. So I wanted to give you all of this background sort of about when I went to Ukraine in the 90s and how it's changed and why I went back. Because the lesson and takeaway is I never planned on going back. My experiences in the 90s, I felt like there was nothing left there for me. My family wasn't there. The records didn't seem to be there. I felt like it was a dead end. The country was poor. We went on a rainy day that just didn't make it appealing. I never really wanted or expected to go back to Luber. So when this opportunity came up, it wasn't like, wow, I want to go back. But as I thought about it, and I thought about the honor for my family and the obligation to represent and to go back and show the locals that not all of the Jews were killed in Luber, that we went on to succeed in life and that we were thriving, it kind of empowered me. But I had trepidation because at the end of the day, I was being asked to go to a mass grave site, stand at the edge of a mass grave surrounded by Germans, and that just felt a little strange to me. I'm comfortable traveling on my own, but I had trepidation. So my husband had to work, my children were busy with camp and school, and so I asked my brother, who had traveled with me back in the 90s, if he would come again with me to Luber, and he did. So with the Protecting Memory Project, they had a press conference, they had cameras, they had simultaneous translation, indoors and outdoors at the mass grave, the memorial openings at the mass graves, simultaneously broadcasting in Ukrainian, German, and English. There were academics from Berlin, from Poland, from Ukraine. We were assigned our own personal translator. And they printed this book about Luber, as they did for every Jewish town that they were erecting a memorial in, which quoted my website and introduced me to other resources about Luber, including academics working at the Jewish Holocaust Center in Ukraine, who I had never met before. It was a really fascinating and wonderful opportunity. These are pictures taken from the day of the memorial opening in Luber. There were actually two. And on the right, you can see the memorial stele, where I circled in yellow the picture of my family. That's my great-grandmother and my great-aunts and uncles and a cousin, 4 of whom died probably in Luber and may be in this mass grave. And you can see that local clergy, both Orthodox Jews and Christian ministers, were part of the ceremony, along with the media, local school children who sang Ukrainian songs. And there were different speakers with microphones. They recorded everything, and it was just an extremely professional experience and a different way of visiting Luber, as you will see at the end of the presentation. So here I had to say what my overall takeaway about how things have changed in Ukraine and why technology plays a big part. So the internet has come along in 25 years. There are web pages. I'm going to show you the Ukraine State Archives website in English. There are digitized records. We're going to talk about Alex Krakowski and his wonderful efforts to access records and to digitize them for free. There have been more indexing projects because of this. We see cell phones in these small shtetl towns. We see power lines and satellite dishes. So things have come a long way, which makes it easier to research and easier to travel. There's visible collaboration throughout Europe with nonprofits and with Jewish organizations. And it's become youthful. Consider that the people born in 1991 at the collapse of the Soviet Union are now 29 years old. And this has a very unusual consequence. So the kids who were born since 91, they speak English. They're taught English in the schools, and they speak Ukrainian. When we went in the 90s, everything was still in Russian. The street signs, the menus, the vernacular on the street, everyone was speaking Russian. Now that's all changed. The street names have changed. The language on the signs has changed. The menus have changed. Everyone is speaking Ukrainian. When you try to be a polite American or Israeli and say a few Russian words like hello or yes, no, or thank you in Russian, you will be politely told to change that to the Ukrainian versions of those words. And this is interesting. Someone pointed out to me, because the Ukrainian youth are not learning Russian in the schools anymore, that we're going to have a genealogy research problem in about 25 years. Because the people who go into the professions of translating or archival research or genealogist won't have the Russian language skills that the older generations, or the people my age, have today, who are able to still read and analyze and interpret the old Russian Empire records that we're all so familiar with looking at. So the youth are not doing Russian anymore, and that's something to consider. So let's circle back for the newbies in the group real quickly. This is a very basic top-level view of the history of Jews in Ukraine. I couch it on the top with when the first Jews in Ukraine arrived, around 850 to 1250 during the Kiev and Rus period, with the bottom entry in 2019 when the first Jewish president of Ukraine was elected, Mr. Vladimir Zelensky. So Jews have been in Ukraine for a very long time, but there have been wars, there has been forcible conscription into the army, there have been pogroms, there has been anti-Semitism. The Jews have had rough periods in Ukraine. So we see where Jewish cantonists are conscripted starting in 1827. Jews are fighting in various wars, including the Crimean War in the 1800s and then the Russo-Japanese War. We see the political unrest of the country during the Russian revolutions, the first in 1905, the later in 1917, followed by civil war, lots of pogroms and violence. We see the man-made starvation that affected people of all faiths throughout Ukraine. Holodomor occurred in the 1930s prior to the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Barbarossa, in 1941. And then we flash forward to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and we see that Ukraine gains its independence. So here's a modern day Google map of Europe, and you can see the placement of Ukraine, the breadbasket in yellow. The word Ukraine means borderland or inland or native land, and the name Ukraine for the country was first used in documents in the 12th century and on maps in the 16th century. The next 7 slides I'm going to go through quickly, but you're welcome to look back in the recording. These are fantastic. I found them. They were created by the Washington Post, a man by the name of Gene Thorpe, and an article accompanying this series of 7 maps back in 2015. And there's a green outline sort of modern day Ukraine that flows through all 7 of the maps, but it gives fantastic history and demonstrates the example that the borders of Ukraine have changed time and time and time again. And it makes it complicated sometimes to find records, because although the genealogical rule of thumb is that you follow records to the modern day administration where a country is currently ruling, that is not always the case in genealogy research. And so if you see on this map that you live on one of sort of the sides of Ukraine that has gone back and forth to various countries over the year, you should be aware that maybe the record should be in Ukraine, and you should start by looking in an appropriate Ukrainian archive. They may be located elsewhere, and they are. So quickly, you'll see that this series of maps goes through hundreds of years, and it gives great definition to the various administrative districts and countries. The last map ends here in 2015, when the disputed areas in the Crimea and in eastern Ukraine were annexed by Russia and are still disputed. So the languages of all of these places within Ukraine are broad and complicated. Ukrainian is spoken in Ukraine today, as we established. During the Russian Empire, the Soviets and Russians were speaking Russian during the Soviet era and the Russian Empire. We all know that those areas of Galicia and Western Ukraine and areas that were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or the Habsburg Empire, Austria-Hungary, include records that were written in Polish and German. We know that Jews prayed in Hebrew but spoke Yiddish, and we know that there are different dialects of Yiddish. We find most gravestones in Ukraine are either in Hebrew, Yiddish, or Russian. And although the next sort of language set doesn't apply, you would think, to Jewish genealogy, there are surprises sometimes in records. And there are other records for Christians that we should mention. We should know that church records in Ukraine can be found in Latin, Ukrainian, Polish, or a language called Church Slavic. For those of you interested in Subcarpathia, Ruthenian and Hungarian are spoken. Romanian was the language in Bessarabia, or the former Bessarabia. And although Jews date back to living in Kiev and Rus, the language back then was none of these languages. It was a language called Old East Slavic. And as there were conquerors and invasions and other ethnic groups, there are languages for the Tatars, the Khazars, the Mongols, and other ethnic groups. But because genealogy records don't date to those periods, it's less important to list all of them. So with language, we've come a long way since the 1990s. Web pages on European websites are often offered in multiple languages. And the key and trick to that is to look in the upper right-hand corner. If you go to a website in any language, look in the right-hand corner, and you'll often see little drop-downs by flags. You could see a British flag or an American flag for English. You might see a French flag for French or German or Russian or Ukrainian. And if you click on those flags, or if there's a drop down that offers you the names of the languages, if you click on those, the whole site will generally translate into another language. And when it does that, this is a translation that's been done by the owner of the site. It is not an automatic translation like you might find for Google Translate if you're using a Chrome browser. Most people know, and I will demonstrate today because I use a Chrome browser, that when I go to a foreign language website, if Google Translate recognizes the language, it will do an algorithmic based translation. Now I say algorithmic because it's not going to be a perfectly academic translation, and there are some laughable instances of the words that come out sometimes. There's one example on Alex Krakovsky's Ukrainian wiki site that we're going to look at, where the word revision list comes out as fairy tales, which I get a great kick out of. You should know that Google Translate is also available as a web page or as a phone app, and I use it when I travel because you can take a picture with your phone, open up Google Translate, and you can translate a menu or a record or the backside of a photo right with your handheld device. It's fantastic for travel. Stephen Morris has some great translating and transliterating tools, as are demonstrated here on the right-hand side. If you look, there are translations between Hebrew and English, between Yiddish and English, and vice versa. You can also convert from Hebrew cursive to print, or vice versa. There are a whole bunch of things here, including Russian, that's useful, Arabic, and some other languages like Greek. And another thing about language that's come a long way in 25 years happened in a taxi cab for me. So when I went in the 1990s, everyone, all the guidebooks and my relatives and other people who had traveled to that part of the world warned me that if you get into a taxi cab, nobody speaks English. And my pronunciation of Russian is so horrible. Even when I say the proper word, people don't understand my American accent, or my cousin's Brooklyn accent, as he was once told that he speaks perfect Russian with a Brooklyn accent. But what's changed is Uber and the GPS. So now when you get into a taxi cab, even if the driver doesn't speak English, and even if you can't say in Ukrainian where you want to go, with Uber, you've probably plugged in the address of where you're going before the cab or the car ever shows up. So you don't have to have an awkward conversation with the cab driver anymore. They have a GPS. You can have a GPS on your handheld, and it's very inexpensive to travel that way, and I used it quite often when I was in Kiev. Okay, so we're going to get to the resources, and we have a lot of them. We have to start with JewishGen. It was around in the 90s. It remains around. It has improved. Some things remain the same. Some things have always been there but are underutilized. But in terms of Ukraine-specific research, the SIGs are now called research divisions, and there are really 4 that predominantly cover areas of Ukraine. The Ukraine SIG, there's Subcarpathia SIG, there's the Bessarabia SIG. Gesher Galicia is technically not a part of JewishGen, but covers many parts of Western Ukraine that border on Poland. I included here links to a great town list on Gesher Galicia. If you have any doubt or question about which Galician towns fall on the Polish border side or the Ukraine border side. There's something called the All Ukraine database. There are Ukraine websites for Ukrainian shtetls on Kihila links like the Luber page I created and shared with you. There are IGRA books, some that have been translated, some that are in translation stages, others that are completed and are now being printed about Ukraine. And I encourage you not only to look for the IGRA book about your town, but to look for the IGRA book for your region or the towns near your town, because the stories will be similar even if the names are different. Jobar, the JewishGen Online Worldwide Burial Registry, has cemetery data, gravestone data from Ukraine. Certainly there are people like all of us on the Family Finder searching for our surnames in certain towns. And then the communities database, which is wonderful because it tells you what the administrative districts and the various names, spellings of your town have been in different languages over the years. And this can be very helpful when you're looking for records. So one thing I'd like to point out is the resource map. I would ask you in person if I were there, how many of you have actually used this? So when you click on the Jewish Gen resource mapping tool, which can be found from any of the communities listed in the communities database, you'll get something that looks like this. And when you zoom over a town or city, this happens to be the city of Novograd-Volynsk, which was also the capital city of an administrative district during the Russian Empire. It gives you a quick glimpse of what else is on Jewish Gen for that city. So it's telling you there's a description in the communities database. There are 325 people searching for this town on the Family Finder. There are IGRA books available. There are cemetery inscriptions collected for Jobar, and there is a Kahila Links webpage. That's fantastic. You can click directly to all of these resources and know very quickly what Jewish Gen has specifically about your town. But more important, I think, is the rest of this map. Because you know that Novograd-Volynsk is your town or city, but look at what nearby Yeren has, or Tereshanka, or over here, Nesalon, or up here, Barashi. And what you might find is where the nearest Kahila Link site is, or where the nearest IGRA book was written. I think it's very valuable to cast a broader net than my grandfather just came from Luber, because as it's turning out and what I found over the years, the records are not necessarily in Luber for my family, although they've lived in Luber for hundreds of years. They could be in the Kahal records, the synagogue community records that are in the next town over, or a revision list for the whole district and not for your town specifically. The only other thing about Jewish Gen that I encourage, particularly newcomers to this process, I think that in a way, there's so much information out there on Jewish Gen and elsewhere that it's very overwhelming for newcomers and beginners. Where to begin, how to create a research plan, what to do first. Well, if you're going to Jewish Gen and you simply know the name of your family or the name of your town, if you drop down from the toolbar across the top of the Jewish Gen homepage, there's something called the unified search, which is relatively new. It used to be you had to search individual databases in different places on Jewish Gen, but the unified search ties it all together. So if you're brand new and starting, go to the unified search and start there to look for your Ukrainian Jewish family. Another oldie but goodie who's been around since the 90s is Miriam Weiner. Miriam has a website, the Roots to Roots Foundation, and on it she has a database of archival documents and where they're located. She has since donated the content, many contents from her website to both Jewish Gen and Ancestry. Back in the 90s, Miriam was the only person out there doing this. She used to travel to Ukraine in particular, also other countries, but she did specialize in Ukraine. She was the first Jewish genealogist that became certified. She took clients, she wrote books, she created this archival documents database, and it's a great shortcut to see where there might be records in the Ukrainian state archives for your town. In fact, I'm going to show you that when I go to the Zhytomyr State Archive in person later in the presentation, I started with Miriam's list. Now, Miriam's list was never comprehensive. It did not include all records. There were records that were not inventoried or indexed or cataloged at the time, but it's still a great place to start. She has other resources still on her website. Some of them are articles that were reprinted from Avotenu or that she wrote herself. But if you want an overview of what types of records you can find in Ukrainian archives, she has a link to genealogy resources there. She also gives a lot of background about the Pinkasim records. These are Jewish community or synagogue records that are held in a collection in a library in Kiev called the Vernadsky Library. And although some people know about this resource, a lot of people don't. So I gave you links here to an explanation of what Pinkasim are. There are examples of what they look like. And there's actually an example of one town's inventory for Berdichev at Vernadsky. At this time, these records have not been digitized. They are not online. And right now, I don't think you can go in person because of COVID, but I'm going to circle back to the importance and the access to these records as an example later. So the Ukrainian archives in 2020 are in English. Now, this first link to the State Archival Service of Ukraine is a work in progress. It appears to be brand new, and some of the links are not working, so it's not even worth going to at this moment. But it is a brand new website, and it's in English, and it's going to link to all of the individual regional archives that are part of its system. Oh, great. So this is the archive of the State Archives of the Zhytomyr region. And as you can see, it's in English. Now, this was not, I don't think this opened in English because of my Chrome browser utilizing Google Translate. This is because they provided a version in English for us to read. So you can kind of read what's going on. And down below, there are news releases. I did not know the State Archives of Zhytomyr just turned 98 years old. Not so important as a genealogist, but down here, this one is. This news on May 29, 2020, just a few weeks ago, says that the database Revizhsky Tales is in full place for use. Well, Revizhsky Tales, like fairy tales, are the revision lists of the Zhytomyr State Archive. And when you click on this link, it actually is opening up in Ukrainian first, and it tells you an article about how a database has been formed for 12 counties of Volyn province, including Volodymyr Volynsk, Dubinsky, Zhytomyr, Zaslavsky, Kavelsky, Kremenitsky, Lutsk, Novograd-Volynsk, Ovruch, Ostra, Rivne, and Starokonstantinov. I'm sure those sound familiar to many of you. And it's showing you what a sample revision list, which was a census, looks like. Lots of family names and relationships. So when you look a little further here and you go into the database, you can basically go into the district you're interested in. Well, actually, I'm more interested in Novograd-Volynsk than I am in Zhytomyr. So I'm going to go back and click on Novograd-Volynsk down here. And it brings you to a PDF where a catalog has been created for all towns. And if you scroll down, which I will do here, I'm interested in Luber. So these are sorted by the name of the town. It's telling you the name of the file where the records are going to be kept. So it's a way for you to advise the archives of what record book you're interested in looking at. There are a lot of pages here, and you're going to need to know in Russian how to spell the name of your town. I happen to know how to do that for Luber. We're going to keep going down here until Luber shows up. It's coming. There it is. Now, if you didn't know that this said Luber, you can cut and paste it. You can open up Google. I just put in Russian to English. I don't even go into Google Translate. It brings up a page where I just pop in, paste my word, and look at that. It says Luber. But it would work the other way around too. So if I didn't know how to spell, let's say, Polonia, it would tell me how to spell it. And then you could see the Cyrillic characters to then go back and search for the name of your town in this index. Well, look at this. This goes on. There are probably 30 references here in the right-hand side column to materials for Luber. And I don't know what these are, but I can go in. Now, I happen to know that this word Ivri means Jewish, but it's telling me different types of files that I can find. So what this is here, this one, for example, is for Luber. This is a list of Jews in the 1816 revision list. And the book number that we're looking at to find these particular records is 172. So for those of you who want to know what records exist for my town, you can start with Miriam Weiner's Roots to Roots Foundation, but for Luber, there were very few listed. Here, this is a comprehensive modern-day snapshot of what, in this case, the Zhytomyr Archive has for Luber in all of these different years. So this is fantastic. Okay. So we're going to go back here. If you need general information about metrical books, which are vital record books, or if you want a similar catalog that was created by a third party describing some of the metrical books in the archives of Ukraine, also in English, you have yet another link here to explore. So you can find out in English what records exist from the Ukrainian state archives throughout the country at this point. This is going to lead me into some secondary sources. Now, this is Alex Krakovsky, who to some of you is a legend at this point. To others, he's new. So let me just tell you for a minute who Alex is. Alex is the redhead on the right-hand picture. In the top picture, he's standing in front of a Ukrainian court building in Kiev, and then the bottom picture, he is in court testifying to a judge. Why is that? So Alex is a young man who found out he had a Jewish branch to his family in recent years and started going to the archives to look at genealogy records to learn more about his Jewish ancestry. And he came up against a wall where archivists were telling him, no, you can't look at the records, or no, you can't copy the records, or no, you can't index the records. Alex didn't like that. So he started fighting the court system in Ukraine and has had, I don't know, 10 or 20 court cases, which he eventually has won. Some are still open, where he has fought for the right for individuals to not only access the records, see the records, but copy the records, and then to not be double charged for the records. So once an archive, for example, has digitized a particular book of revision lists from Luber in 1816, if they charge once for it to get the digitized images, they can't charge the next guy to do it again. So Alex is like a superhero in terms of records access for Jewish genealogists in Ukraine. He's based in Kiev. He's married and has a lovely wife and son, little Alex. And I was fortunate that when I found out I was going back to Ukraine last year for Protecting Memory, I didn't know him other than his internet presence, but I reached out, asked to meet. We ended up spending 3 days together. I went to court with him and his group. He calls them his merry band of archivists who support him when he goes into court. I didn't understand a word of Ukrainian in court, but some of the other archivists there were helpful and explained to me what the process was and what was going on. I got to know a few of them for coffee afterwards. It was a really wonderful experience. And I got to see Alex in action, and he's the real deal. He doesn't take clients, he doesn't charge money. He is a true volunteer who just believes that we all have the right to access our records for our Jewish ancestors that are found throughout Ukraine. So his work continues, but the way that he shares it is on this Ukrainian wiki page. Now, using Google Translate and my Chrome browser, when I go to this URL, which is here on the right-hand side, my page automatically translates into English, and unfortunately it's not a perfect translation, but it's good enough that you can see the links to the various districts. You'll see the content on the left-hand side here. If you scroll down to the district that you're interested in, you can then see what's available. So it looks like this for Novigrad-Volynsk district. I did the yellow highlighting. I was making the point of where we have added the page numbers for specific towns and which books carry in different years information about the Jewish residents of Luber. But this is not how it shows up for everyone. Usually it's just the name of the book with the year and the book title or the book number. And then you click on it to see the actual digitized images. You can either see them if you have the bandwidth, or you can download the file to your own hard drive if you have the space. And many people have been doing that. I know that there's an effort through Ukraine SIG or Ukraine Research Division at Jewish Gen, Michael Levin's Saul Kaplan Foundation, as well as the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People. There are a lot of people who are downloading everything that Alex puts up because there's a fear that somehow this Ukrainian wiki page or Alex are not going to keep it there. There's no evidence that this is going anywhere, but the point I make is that there are backups now of the material that Alex is making available to everyone, and you can keep a backup to a book if you want it on your hard drive too. But the project that I initiated when I met Alex, because my question to him was, Alex, I'm in Ukraine, I'm going to Zhytomyr, how do I get a full set digitized of all revision lists for Novigrad-Volynsk district? I was willing, as town leader for Luber and having done some district level work for Novigrad-Volynsk, I was willing to put that money out and then run a campaign to raise the money. So let's talk a little bit about raising the money. Some of people can go and pay the archives and buy everything, and then you have all these great records for your family that go nowhere past your family. I am a collaborative person, and I like to share all the records. So what I do, I like to do town projects, raise money from people interested in the same town or records, and then make them available to everyone, whether that's on the Jewish Gen Ukraine Research Division All Ukraine database, or on my Kehila Links websites, or like a IGRA book translation. Now you can raise money through Jewish Gen. You can be a town leader, you can set up a project, and all of these great Jewish Generosity of Ukraine projects are listed, where you can donate to someone's project at any time. It's a great setup, and because it goes through Jewish Gen as a nonprofit, it's tax deductible. But the reality is that I wanted to move faster. I was in Ukraine, I was buying the records, I was trying to get things translated and up online quickly. So I went outside of the system for no other reason than speed. I wanted to raise the money quickly. I wanted to get it to Ukraine so we could digitize the records so Alex could put them up on his website and anyone would have access to them. I wrote about all of this on Lara Diamond's wonderful blog, Genealogy, back in August of 2019, and I list the exact pages where Deborah Glassman created a town finding aid within the Russian language materials so that in these huge, massive revision list books, individuals interested in their town would be able to find them. And so some of that translated well into these definitions where you can see like pages 1 to 147 of this book up here for Novigrad-Volynsk, pages 148 to 240 for an unknown town that didn't translate properly in Google Translate. Pages 335 to 478 are where you'll find Luber and where we did. So I think it was important to explain this process. I am running way late on this webinar. We are going to zoom through a whole bunch of other resources without a lot of explanation. I do want to get to some of the travel stuff before we finish, but the takeaway here is you can access the Ukrainian State Archives to find out what materials they have. You can then purchase the digitization of books that haven't been digitized already, and someone like Alex will put it up on his website for free for anyone for the future to then create town projects of their own, perhaps doing the translating or creating a names index that can be donated to Jewish Gen, and then everyone's going to have more records access. We weren't able to do this 25 years ago because of the language translation tools, because of the archives, because of Alex's work fighting for access to the archives, because of what we now have online and all of these people who are trying to process this tremendous amount of data that we now have where we used to have very little. The opportunity here is extraordinary. So these are examples of the revision books. Deborah Glassman is someone I work with on Luber and Ostrupol. She has created this new way of looking at revision lists where we're not just translating the names on a page, but we're looking at the households over a period of years and books. We couldn't do this when we only had one book for 1816, but when you have all of the revision lists for 1816, 1834, 1858, 1874, you're able to look at it and analyze it from book to book, from household to household over time. You can analyze who the neighbors were. You can look at who the daughters are marrying. You can make assumptions about the son-in-law's surnames and the relationships. There's just so much potential here now that we have more data. And this is Deborah Glassman's website, the Jewish Families of Ostrupol. She has broken out and she's doing other towns, not just Ostrupol anymore. I encourage you, if you're interested in Ostrupol, Luber, or any of these other towns she's working on surname indexes for, it's a fantastic website with lots of lists. Michael Levin's Saul Kaplan Foundation, I mentioned this earlier. He has all kinds of historical essays. He's also downloading the Krakowski stuff. He has some cemetery lists. He's created some surname indexes. And just this week, I read a press release that he's being awarded the 2020 IGRA Stern Grant for an upcoming interactive Shtetls map. So take a look at Michael's website. There's a lot of good information there. There are a lot of shtetls that are included. Vitaly Buryak has a history of Jewish communities in Ukraine website. The only real solid genealogical material, it's a lot of background on the history of various Jewish towns, but he does have some PDFs, of modern Jewish newspapers, so worth a look. Nadia Lippis, also sometimes called Sarah, is a visible presence at IGGS conferences. She is a professional who charges money for access to the records that she indexes and places on her genealogy database. She's also working on some pogrom era records that I heard her say in Cleveland at the conference she was going to be making free, but I couldn't find a link to that. Marshall Katz. Marshall has a Subcarpathia genealogy website where he is selling copies of records. He and his team are going into areas of Subcarpathia, Ukraine, formerly in the Hungarian counties. And there may be some things here that are not available on Jewish Gen. So to look at your names, your surnames, or to search for your town is free. The only thing you would pay for is if you want to order the records. Family Search, another monumental agreement came out this week. This has been a great week to report on Ukraine. Family Search signed a new agreement with the Ukrainian State Archives that they're going to go back in and start digitizing records again. The list of what they're doing has not been clarified. The time frame has not been clarified. There are a lot of details, but the fact that Family Search, LDS, the Mormon Church, is back in Ukraine with an agreement with the government means that more records are going to become available on Family Search for us. In the meantime, there is a wiki for information about broader Ukraine genealogy on Family Search. They've done a couple of educational syllabuses that, similar to Miriam Weiner's book material, explain the various record types and give examples. And there are limited browsable images and books about Ukraine that you can search for in the catalog at Family Search. I saw this slide. It was from way back in 2011. It was created by Khalil Mer, who used to be on the IAJGS Board of Directors. He's now retired. This was an old picture of where Ukraine had microfilmed through 2011. In green is what was complete. As you can see, a large part of the country was never accomplished. Earlier, I mentioned the Pinkasim synagogue records at the Vernadsky Library in Kiev. The unofficial word is that the Mormons are talking to Vernadsky, and that record set may be included in their microfilming, which makes me very excited. This is a great website, Vera Miller's Find Lost Russian and Ukrainian Family website. It's also a blog. Vera Miller is not Jewish. She is a genealogist who reports on all resources in Ukrainian and Russian languages for all ethnic and religious groups. She includes access to many military databases that are in Russian. I listed a few examples, but you can see across the top of her website here, she has cemetery databases, links to free databases, other resources, and she even recommends researchers. Vera is another superhero in the world of genealogy as far as I'm concerned. The Internet Archive. Some of you may be familiar with this because of the Wayback When machine. Reclaim the Records is housing some of the New York City indexes that they have fought for access to. And interestingly, Brooke Schreier-Gans, who's the head of Reclaim the Records, is related to Alex Krakowski, who's doing access to records in Ukraine. So there might be something genetically on that side of their DNA. But on the Internet Archive, if you haven't been here, archive.org, you can search for all kinds of things, including videos and music, books, but it's really like a Google book search where you can then browse images of digitized materials. And when you search under the category Russian Empire genealogy resources, there were 734 results in various languages, but all kinds of genealogical material or information about your town. Deb Glassman found this great example for us, where right there on page 103, second series down in Polish, is the household count for Luber, and it was done in 1765. So here's information that you can learn about your towns in a foreign language in an obscure book that has been digitized and may offer more information for your search. Similarly, I mentioned Google Books. You need to take another look at WorldCat. So worldcat.org, you can go in and use Roman character letters, which I did in the example here. You see I typed in Luber, spelled the Russian way transliterated, L-Y-U-B-A-R, and it came up with 5 results on the left-hand side. But when you read them, they're really transliterations of different languages. So it tells me about records for a Landsmannschaft in Evo in New York. It tries to transliterate Yiddish, kind of comes out looking like German, but this is the constitution of the Landsmannschaften, not at Evo, but at the New York Public Library. And then it tells me about photos of families from Luber at 2 Canadian archives, a UK archive, and NYU, where I would never thought to look for photos of people from Luber. And then down here, there's even a result in Cyrillic, which is for the metrical Kniga, the metric book, from 1760 to 1790 that's held nowhere else than at the Family History Library in Salt Lake City. So this is also a quick way using WorldCat. The results are coming back in multiple languages, and it's going to reveal for you some repositories you might not think of that hold records for your family or town. So take another look at WorldCat. Quickly, maps. There are maps all over the internet now. Here's a great map from Upper Volhynia, Ukraine in 1665 from the David Rumsey collection. There are newspapers. Libraria is the Ukrainian online periodical archive. And there are over 700,000 pages of 400 publications in multiple languages from the different regions of Ukraine. And look at that, an example I found is the Interwar Jewish Press of Galicia. There are 27 titles, and you can click right to the PDFs. Cemetery resources. I'm not going to go through these. You can look back over the presentation, but Jobar is not the only game in town. There's Toledot, there's Mitzvat Emet. Find a Grave has 601 cemeteries in Ukraine, and then there are others. Israel. You guys know better than I do, and I need to come visit and really focus again on Ukraine resources. So many opportunities to sort of catalog and identify where there are more modern resources available about Ukrainian Jewish families in Israel. One I'd like to point out is at the Central Archives for the History of Jewish People at Hebrew University, something called the Zikaron Project. This was a donor, from what I understand, who wanted to include Soviet-era materials related to anti-Semitism, but part of what they collected from the archives in Ukraine includes KGB files. When you click on this, you need to have a username and password, so you're going to have to reach out to the staff at the Central Archives to find out how to access that material, or they may do it for you, although I know that they're understaffed. Holocaust by bullets. This is a whole lecture I was going to give in San Diego. Not sure if it's going virtual yet or not, but the takeaway here is there wasn't a lot of literature or a way to document what happened to families, individuals, or towns in Ukraine for many, many, many years, and that has changed. The Soviet archives have opened up. The German archives have opened up. There are multinational cooperative projects where there's been sharing of records in various languages. There are memoirs, there are testimonies, and a lot of it is online, and a lot of it is in English. So if you always wanted to know the story of what happened, there are lists of names, like at Yad Vashem, they had the Soviet Extraordinary Commission lists. But if there wasn't a name, there's a lot more information about what happened to the towns. So a lot of that can be recreated, and you might have some closure or some more information about what may or may not have happened to your town. Discussion groups. Takeaway: Jewish Gen is not the only game in town anymore. However, Jewish Gen upgraded their discussion group. They no longer have individual research divisions mailing lists. You just subscribe to one Jewish Gen mailing list. If you want to place something about Ukraine, you put in a little hashtag Ukraine. You can also search the discussion group archives by hashtag Ukraine, and you can find all the past information about your town or research or a repository until your heart's content. There are other resources here for individual towns that are mailing lists created through RootsWeb or Yahoo groups or independently. I encourage you to look at those websites to see what town discussion groups exist, or do a Google search. Facebook groups, there are a ton. You can look under individual towns like Rotin or Mogilev Podolsk, but you can also look at general Jewish genealogy. One of my favorite new finds this year is that last one with the asterisk. It's called Ukrainian Genealogy, Our Ancestors. In Ukrainian, Our Ancestors translates into Nashi Predki, and it's part of a New Jersey Ukrainian genealogy group. They happen to have done an all-day virtual seminar a few weeks ago. It was fantastic. So maybe not just look at Jewish genealogy in Ukraine, you can also look at general Ukrainian genealogy, Facebook groups, and websites. This is a list of how to find professionals. If you're interested, there are 3 different directories out there. And then these are some takeaway pictures, because I'm running way over time, Daniel, I apologize. But quickly, the takeaway here is the signage in Ukraine and Kiev is all in English now. This is at the airport. This is, they have these, like this Kiev funicular guideposts. They have these guideposts in English that direct you how to get to major tourist sites. When you look at the people on the street, they are young, they are tourists, they are Western, they are shopping. Here's even a coffee shop. Everything's in English on the street for you to find your latte. There are cranes in the air all over Kiev. New buildings, old buildings are being renovated. There's this Ferris wheel down in the Padil neighborhood. It's just much more vibrant than I recall from 20 years ago when I went. As far as food goes, you can find everything from traditional Ukrainian salo and harolka to shawarma that was not kosher or particularly Israeli, but it was shawarma in a food court mall right in downtown Kiev. There is kosher food even at the airport. And then this was a kosher food truck that was parked next to the Brodsky Synagogue. So there is Jewish and vegetarian and Israeli food. They're very big on ethnic food. They like Italian. There are a lot of Georgian restaurants. Georgian food's very popular right now. I happen to like it. And then this was even a menu from a Crimean restaurant. Museums. Some of you might recognize this statue. My family used to call it the Motherland statue or the Mother Russia statue. It's not called that anymore. They even changed the name of the museum. It used to be, and I can't say it properly in Russian, but it was basically like the history of the Russian Victory Museum in World War II or something like that. Now they don't call it that. They renamed it. They rebranded it. You can see the name right on the building is in English and in Ukrainian. It's now the National Museum of the History of Ukraine and the Second World War. There's a whole section about the Holocaust, and there are photos, so many photos. And guess what? Walking through, I even saw a photo of my great uncle. Unbelievable. The buildings have been renovated. Babi Yar has been updated. You want to go tour Babi Yar, the signs are in English. There are maps. It's a beautiful park. Over by this particular monument within Babi Yar, there's security. There are video cameras and a call box because years ago there was some vandalism. That's not going to happen again. There's a call for volunteers at Babi Yar in English. This is the Brodsky Synagogue. Beautiful. 25 years ago, it was gutted and abandoned and looked horrible. Now it's an active congregation. The hotels are modern. This happens to be in Zhytomyr. This happens to be the Zhytomyr State Archive. Alex, my brother, this is the director of the Zhytomyr State Archive. Nobody there speaks English. Nothing is in English. We'll save that conversation for another time. These are the types of things that you see at the Zhytomyr State Archive. I used Merriam-Webster's inventory in English online to then write out my requests there in, I guess it's in Russian. And then they have a card catalog and they bring you these big books. This is Luber. So after Protecting Memory did the gravesite, our mass gravesite memorial opening, I was very fortunate to be hosted by the staff of this local gymnasium. Gymnasium is a school. This one happens to be like K through 12. They had two exhibits inside. One was a museum exhibit of what Ukrainian life is like, and I found this great little treasure. It's a piece of original ceramic plateware by the Sussman factory. That might not mean anything to those of you not familiar with the Novograd-Volynsk administrative district, but Sussman was the Jewish ceramic factory of the era. Everybody bought this type of ceramic, and it was run by Jews, and many Jews worked there. They were very famous for the region. So I was very pleased to see they had an example in a typical Ukrainian home. Then they had a second exhibit, which was a museum exhibit about World War II. And what's so wonderful about it is that in each of these cases that you see, they talked about the military, they talked about dead people from the town, but they also had Jewish exhibits with lots of genealogical material. So here's something. I went to Luber twice in the 90s. No one mentioned that the high school had an exhibit on the Jews of Luber with original, never before seen or digitized in the Western world materials, but there were newspaper articles and there were letters handwritten about the history of the town, and there were lists of people who were killed in the Holocaust. And there were maps hand-drawn of where the Jewish synagogues were and where the Jewish community lived. This was fantastic. There were photos, and not just of families, but photos with school children and political adult groups and Jewish members of the military. This was just an extraordinary find, and I like to leave the presentation saying, I'd like to motivate and inspire you that you need to partner with these locals, the academics, the nonprofits, the Jewish synagogues, and yes, the non-Jews who still live in your town, because clearly in Luber, there are non-Jewish Gentiles, there are Gentiles who care a great deal about preserving the history of their Jews from Luber. So these are some of my friends from Luber. This is the older woman who I had met 25 years ago and was in the picture from the mass grave with my family. Maya's still there. This is the principal of the gymnasium and the teachers. Larissa was the English high school teacher, and then we took the maps in her hand that we found in the Jewish exhibit at the school, and we walked the town, and we went to everywhere that was on that map where there used to be something Jewish. And where I had come to Luber 25 years ago and nothing seemed to feel connected, everything felt connected when we followed this treasure map. It was unbelievable how many buildings still existed and places that I could actually attach a written historical story about Luber to a physical place. For example, this building here was a Jewish hospital, and Larissa, who is not Jewish, was born there. These were people who live in the Jewish hospital now. This young man was one of Larissa's students from the high school. People were willing to come talk to us about the history of the buildings, about the Jews. They wanted to know all about America and about our schools and our jobs and lifestyle. I just can't say how the fear went away. Where I was afraid in the 90s, where my family made me afraid of going back, we were greeted with such hospitality. And in this picture, this is two of the local government officials greeting us in traditional Ukrainian clothing with their traditional offering of bread and salt. Now this looks more like a cake than bread. It was very ornate, even by Ukrainian standards, but they were fantastic. And they served us this great meal. And I told you about poverty at the beginning of this presentation, and how when we went to Luber, it was so poor back in the 90s that in 1997, someone invited us to go to a restaurant to have lunch. And we walked in, there was no business, there was no bar, there were no people, there was no food out. And a waitress came over and through our interpreter asked us what we wanted, and then said it would be 4 hours because she had to go to the next town to buy the food, to bring it back, to prepare it for us so that they could serve a restaurant meal to a bunch of American tourists. In contrast, this is the meal that was waiting for the Protecting Memory bus when we arrived in Luber. And as you can see, the bar is fully stocked and there's plenty of food. This is a disappointment. This is the cemetery, and where I showed a picture of the cemetery that I thought was overgrown years ago. Well, it's really overgrown now, so much so that it is impassable. You cannot access it, and that was a great disappointment. Some things have come along a long way, like cell phones and satellite dishes and even rental cars, which you couldn't rent years ago. I have a story about the rental car that is not perfect. Contact me if you're traveling and I'll share it with you, but at least there are rental cars. And then some things remain the same. There's still well water because there's no indoor plumbing. It's not potable, but they use it for bathing. There's still outhouses and not with a toilet seat, very uncomfortable, lots of bugs. There's still people who are very poor who are riding in horse and carts. There's still cattle crossing the roads, and you still see people selling honey and kvass and produce and those like banya sticks for like the bath on the side of the road between Zhytomyr and Kiev on the highway. So before you travel, do your homework, have a list of questions, allow for serendipity to guide you. Please collaborate. They want to be educated as much as we do at this point. And recognize the paradox. And I demonstrate my paradox with this picture. This is not two pictures. This is one picture of a building with a fence in front of it. And on the fence, there's this Chagall-ish looking painting of a Ukrainian with the storks, because there's lots of storks in the power lines and in the trees, and the local fauna and the rainbow, and it looks so idyllic. But the building that it's in front of was this horrible place that held the Jews during 1941, and terrible things happened there. They were starved, they caught diseases, women were raped, and it's very likely that my great aunt was a victim in this building. So for as much as I enjoyed the people I met and Luber seemed beautiful, we can't forget, even when we do like the people and we see beauty in the country and we are collaborating, what terrible things happen there. And this is my family. My great aunt Bronya, my grandfather from Luber, my great grandfather Avram, who was a Cantonist, and his great grandfather was born in Luber between 1715 and 1732. I know this now from the revision list that Alex and Deb Glassman have helped me to access, which means that my family lived in Luber for at least 226 years between 1715 and 1941. My goal now is to get back to 1665. So that is my very long-winded presentation. And Daniel, do you have quick questions that we should answer?
Wow. First of all, Helena, I need to tell you that my head is spinning, but I am delighted, just as many, many other people that are saying here that this has been a wonderful presentation, and I agree with all of them. I actually had plan for this past Passover to go to Ukraine, and for obvious reasons, we had to cancel it. So I'm looking forward now to prepare myself better with your talk and make the best of my trip as well. And I encourage everybody to do the same. People are asking, and I will have to ask you as well for a handout because you had too many URLs over there and too many good tips. So if you can prepare a handout, it doesn't have to be for tomorrow, but we will, if you agree, we will put it on the IGRA website together with this recording.
Yes.
Doron is asking, what is a revision list? If I understand fine, it is kind of like a census in Ukraine, right?
Yes, exactly. Except don't think of it like an American census. If you've seen the American censuses, it's really like a list of household members, and it can include anecdotal information like someone died since the last census, or in my family case, someone was sent to Siberia, or somebody is away serving in the military. So there can be great personal details, not just names and relationships.
Okay, and Alan asked way in the beginning about Ukraine pre-war being part of Galicia.
Sure. So the western part of Ukraine, modern day Ukraine today, was a part of Galicia. And perhaps we can direct him to Gesher Galicia, that has fantastic maps and a database with records that have been indexed and lots of material.
So basically, Ukraine has been anybody's else countries as well. Okay,
Many.
good to know. Miriam is asking, once I have the page number and the reference, what do I do to find the information so that I can see and read it? I guess not everything is available right now, correct?
So if she's talking about Alex Krakowski's website, all of the PDFs are available. Some of them you have to download because your bandwidth may not allow you to browse through the various number of pages in a book online. But if you know the pages and you have the link from Alex's Ukrainian Wiki website, you can go right to the page. And, let's say for a town of Luber, there are 60 pages. You could even print out those pages and then ask a Russian reader to translate or find your family in those pages.
Okay, and Ellen is asking for a good website that will translate Yiddish. Well, Yiddish is written in Hebrew words, but it's definitely not Hebrew. I don't know how Google Translate will do with Yiddish. I know Steve Morse probably has a one step for translating Yiddish into English. Do you have any other tips regarding that?
No, same. Although oddly, I have put some Yiddish into Google Translate and it does recognize it. I don't, only when I use printed words, like printed Hebrew Yiddish.
Okay. And Sarah has a long one. I have a question regarding Jewish migration in the 19th century. It seems that the Russian Empire was encouraging Jews to move south from Belarus and Lithuania to the colonies in Ukraine. Is that true? I think my ancestors were relative newcomers to Ukraine when they left the US, when they left for the US in 1904. Do you know anything about these colonies and encourage Russian Jews to go south?
Not without more information. No, I'm not sure. I will make a general comment that it used to be, we were sort of taught that Jews didn't go very far from where they lived. And certainly my family living in the same town for 200 or 300 years is an example. But the truth is the Jews did move around quite a bit because of commerce, because of marriages, because of conscription. So I don't have a specific answer without more information. but they did move around.
Okay, and of course, everybody wants Alex first name, last name, phone number, email, and wiki page. Uh, that will be in the handout, I can already tell you, or in the recording, you show us over there the URL. So by tomorrow, that should be on the IGRA page. How do you cope with different spelling of family names and first names? Is asking Martin.
How do
Martina.
you deal how do you deal with it? You just have to keep a list of all the possibilities. And when you're searching databases, be very creative. Use the phonetic search or the Dage-Mokadov search. The problem is even in Cyrillic, like my name is Schindelman in English, my maiden name. Now my Russian relatives, they say Schindelman, so the emphasis is elsewhere, and I've seen the name spelled different ways in Cyrillic. My name is also spelled in Polish a couple of different ways. So the problem with names is true for all Jewish genealogy. You just have to keep a running list of possibilities and be creative when you're searching.
And I do know that most of the search engines today will take care of those spellings as well. Companies and search engines have learned not only from Daichmokotov and the usual already spelling options, but also key mistakes when you type or based on other family trees as well. I'm gonna allow one more question just because this is the last one related directly to the presentation. Nancy is asking, are there revision lists for Western Ukraine? I guess yes, right? It's for every Ukraine has revision list.
Well, that's interesting, and I guess you're gonna do a little homework about your town or administrative district. Keep in mind that the Russian Empire was in charge when the revision lists were being created in the 1800s. So Galicia was in Western Ukraine was a part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So depending on where the town is, where it falls on the line between the Habsburgs and the Russians, and where those records are, there may not be Russian Empire lists if the town was never in the Russian Empire. But I think there's a variety in Galicia of those that fall on different sides of those borders. So you have to take a better look at Gesher Galicia for that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ellen. I know I have a blast, and I'm pretty sure everybody did as well. Again, in the chat, you have the URL of the Israel Genealogy Research Association, and very soon, hopefully by tomorrow even, we will have this recording already available there. Whenever Ellen, no pressure, will be able to give us the handout, we're going to make sure to publish it there as well. And if you enjoyed today's session, I'm pretty sure you are going to enjoy the whole day seminar that we're preparing for June 23. Where we're going to start from 11 o'clock in the morning to 2 p.m. Israel time. We're going to have some lectures in Hebrew from different archive and different places in Israel for information. And then in the afternoon, we're going to have more lectures in English. One URL you need to register, but it's one URL to register for all of them. You can go in and out. And the keynote, which is going to be at 6 p.m., is going to be Gilad Yafed, the founder and CEO of MyHeritage. In the meantime, again, Ellen, thank you very, very much for this wonderful lecture. And everybody else, just have a wonderful day and keep yourself safe.